To start off our evening, our Dean, Mary Cavanaugh, is going to welcome us to the Maria Rosenbloom 8th Annual Memorial Lecture. So,
thank you, Gary. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Dr. Mary Cavanaugh. I had the great privilege for these last 7 years now to be the Dean at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College. And I'm so pleased to see everyone here tonight and to welcome you to the 8th Annual Lecture of Maria Rosenbloom Memorial Lecture entitled Religion and Justice, Enemies or Partners. Professor Maria Rosenbloom joined the Hunter School of Social Work faculty in 1962, for those of you that may not know that, where she remained for 30 years as a highly regarded and extraordinary teacher. I still hear stories about Maria. She developed the first course on social work in the Holocaust. She published extensively and she presented workshops on lessons from the Holocaust. Professor Rosenbloom fulfilled what she perceived as the responsibility of survivors to, quote, bear witness. Tonight's distinguished speaker, Dr. Susannah Heschel, is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish and Protestant thought during the 19th and 20th centuries, including the history of biblical scholarship, Jewish scholarship on Islam, and history of anti-Semitism. Her scholarship focuses on topics that resonate clearly with Maria's life's work. We're so excited to hear from her and to engage in dialogue at the conclusion of her talk tonight. You know, Maria was an inspiration to so many of us, even though I wasn't here at Hunter when Professor Rosenbloom was on faculty. She has left an enduring legacy here in the school and in our field. And it's with that deep commitment that we remember her work tonight and its place within its history of genocide and human atrocities and not forgetting it. I'd like to extend our great thanks to Dr. Gary Mallon. Gary, thank you so much for taking leadership with Dr. Martha Bragin, whom I also want to thank for your great leadership, Martha. And to Jake Gutter for all that you do, Jacob, to put these great events together. I'm really very grateful. We're all grateful to you all for your great leadership. And we especially want to extend our gratitude, and I personally as Dean would like to extend my deep gratitude to Dr. Alex Gitterman, who has generously endowed this important lecture series and its impactful memorial to his beloved aunt, Maria Rosenbloom. And thank you so very much, Alex, for this enduring commitment to your aunt's work and to the work that we too here do in the School of Social Work and in our professions as well. Our deep and abiding thanks to you. And welcome again to everyone to what I know is going to be an important discussion. Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you to take the program from here. Welcome, Alex, and thank you again.
I'd like to thank Dean Cavanaugh, Dean Mellon, Professor Bragin, for all the efforts on behalf of my aunt's memorial lecture. The amount of effort and time you've put into it has a tremendous meaning to myself and my family. Dean Cavanaugh has given you a sense of my aunt's professional contributions. I'd like to tell you a little bit about her as a person. She was born to an Orthodox family with 6 daughters. 2 did not make it to adulthood. The oldest daughter, Frieda Hirsch, and husband Ucho Hirsch, saw the handwriting on the wall and saw the disaster loomed and took off for Palestine before the Holocaust. They created our Israeli family. They had a daughter by the name of Nana, who was my cousin's sister. And she was part of endowing the scholarship also. She had 3 children, two daughters. They have 5 children. And now we've had the blessings of 3 great children. And there's nothing more meaningful to survivors than the birth of a child. It takes a little of the sting of all the traumas and devastations away. The next sister was Celia, who married Jacob Goldstein. They did not survive the Holocaust. We were all in the Kolomea ghetto, and there was a death march that they were on. My father was on, my grandparents was on, Maria's husband was on, and they were murdered on that death march. Celia and her husband had a son by name of Menek, my cousin brother. As they were walking on the death march, my grandfather quoted something from the Bible that told Menek to make a run for it. Menek ran, got shot. Luckily, the bullets went through him. He found a deserted house and hid in the closet for a couple of days. Then he saw that if he could project himself, he could jump over the Kolomea ghetto wall. And he did that. And in the still of the night, he crawled to friends of a family who were righteous Christians. They hid him in the barn, and for 2 years and 2 brutal winters, to pass the time of day, he found some old discarded chemistry books, high school chemistry books. He started reading them. Long story to be told, he wound up at the University of Bern after the Holocaust and got his doctorate in biochemistry. Came to this country, and for his work on L-Dopa, treating Parkinson's disease, he got the next level to the Nobel Prize. My aunt was crazy about her niece and nephew. Because they were so accomplished, my niece, for example, I didn't mention, was a renowned eye surgeon who was married to a pediatric urologist. She spoke 6 languages, and at this late stage is studying French. My aunt referred to her as my brilliant niece, and my cousin as my brilliant nephew. I quite didn't fit the category, so she honored me by calling me my almost as brilliant nephew. And that was my aunt's wonderful humor. The next daughter in line was my mother, Franja Hirsch, who married Aaron Schlussel, who died, as I mentioned, in the death march. We were in the Kolomea ghetto. I was 4 years old. And she took me by the hand in the middle of the night and walked me out of the ghetto into the dark night, into a lot of despair. Unbelievably courageous woman. The younger sister, Matilda, Maddie, became to know as Maria and Mary. She was different than the other sisters. She was a reader. She just always sat and read books. At that time, Jewish girls could only go up to the 8th grade in education. It wasn't public, I'm sure. And she put up a fuss. She refused to eat. She cried. She carried on. And my grandfather was a loving man, could not stand to see his daughter suffer so much. So he traveled a long distance to the chief rabbi and asked him, what should I do? I've got a baby daughter that I love, and she's miserable. And the rabbi gave it much thought, and he told him, Shmuel, I'll tell you what, treat her as if she was a boy. and let her go to college. Now, not exactly a feminist perspective, but for that time, it was quite remarkable. And my aunt went to a Polish university, Warsaw University, and the Jewish students were treated terribly. They had to stand in the back of the room. They were beat up. They were bullied. But she decided she was going to get even and go on for a master's, of all things, in Polish literature. She wanted to show them. And same things, back of the room, bullied. And there was a kind professor that she told us many times about, who felt that this brilliant student shouldn't be treated this badly. And he invited her to come up to the front of the room and take a seat. Well, that was another trauma my aunt suffered, because that professor got murdered for his kindness. He got stabbed to death. She mentioned his names often to keep his memory alive for his kindness. My mother's husband was a pharmacist, and he is really the family hero. He got my mother and my Aunt Maria false papers. So if they could get out of the ghetto, they had some chance. Maria had a friend by the name of Blanca Rosenberg, who already had escaped the ghetto and got a job in a factory in the town. She went there, saw Blanca, and Blanca got a job in the factory. And they have common experiences of a number of times they got caught and almost got murdered. And she put in a book called To Tell It Last by Blanca Rosenberg. And that's a living legacy of what they went through and partly what my mother and I went through. She wound up in the Warsaw Ghetto, and she participated in the uprising. She got shot twice in the back, and she was left for being dead with some bodies over her. Miraculously, the bullets went through her, and she survived. Not only she survived, but she joined the underground. And she was involved in being like a courier of false papers for children, and being part of the link that these papers got passed on to, so Jewish children could somehow, had some chance of escaping the Holocaust. I remember still to this day my mother's scream of joy when she found out her nephew Menek and my Aunt Maria had survived the Holocaust. She got a position at UNRWA and helped us to come to this country. We went to a little town in Germany called Neckargemünd, and she got us a sponsor, and my mother and I came to this country. My mother had remarried after the war, and my father, whose name, Pinkus Gitterman, I take and have tremendous love for. After 6 months, my aunt came to this country, and I found out she was going to be my roommate. My life was never the same. My aunt was a volcano, and she decided I was settling for too little, that the Bronx was my universe, and there had to be more to life than the Bronx. So she took me screaming and dragged me to museums, to library, to concerts, and to the Mecca of culture, radio music, City Hall. I fell quickly in love with this aunt of mine. Excuse me. I learned of many things from her. One was the power of words. As she was dragging me through the streets, my parents, who didn't have much money, bought me a new pair of slacks. And I fell and I ripped my slacks. And I knew I was going to get it for being careless. My aunt promised me that there'd be no punishment at all. I said, how could you punish me? Watch. We came home with the rip in the pants. My mother looked at it, and Maria said, I promised God that he would be not punished for an accident. My mother looked at her younger sister, smiled, and she knew she was bested by this younger sister once again. Maria also started teaching me about courage. We went to Orchard Beach, and my aunt had this crazy idea of going to the beach and not staying in the sun. We stayed in the shade, and to the end of her life, she had this magnificent complexion. And we were online for about an hour waiting for a bus to take us back home. And these two big bullies came in and cut in front of us. And Maria started screaming, calling for the police. And I asked her to be quiet because I thought we were going to get killed. And she said to me, "You're in America now. You never have to be scared again. Don't be bullied. Stand up for yourself." And the police came, took the two men away, and everybody online applauded her. I think I remember it very clearly. When I was in high school, Mary, after professional experiences, she went to Delphi School of Social Work. And we went to her graduation. And that was compelling to see someone in the family, cap and gown, being honored. She was honored as being the most outstanding student in her class. After the ceremony was over, she told my parents that she wanted to talk to me. We found the bench. And she said to me, "You think life is playing ball, going on dates, and having fun. Your father's family had 4 brothers, a family of over 100, and you're the only ones that survived. You owe more than just having fun. You have to give back in life." That lesson has stayed with me forever. When I was in college, I read a book by Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, called Man's Search for Meaning. And the book was about finding meaning in life by not taking, by not self-gratification, but by giving to others. Auntie's life has guided me. One thing that's been very special for me is that my son and daughter equally fell in love with my aunt. My son Daniel, who, if I can give a plug for, is the chairman of a very large public policy department at Chapel Hill, and also has a chair. And gave me a grandson and a granddaughter, Clara Max. My daughter Sharon, who lived close to Auntie and spent a lot of time with her. But before that, I just want to give her a plug too. She graduated with honors in English and got a degree in library science, a master's degree, and has been a library cataloger for the City University system. In my aunt's later years, my daughter became a major caretaker, and they loved each other dearly. So I just want to give you a little flavor of this special woman who had a powerful influence, not only on my life, but many lives. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell a little bit of her story and our story. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Alex. Martha, go ahead, Martha.
My honor and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. When we thought about how we could meet these very difficult times that we are facing today and what lessons might be learned from the Holocaust to help us to think deeply in the traditions that had nurtured Professor Rosenbloom, I hoped for and contacted Susannah Heschel, who was gracious enough to immediately reply that she would indeed be honored and happy to meet this moment. Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies program at Dartmouth College. She's been a pioneer in Jewish feminism and brought feminist theory and post-colonial theory to her analyses of modern Jewish thought, Jewish-Christian relations, and Jewish views of Islam. Her books include a study of 19th century Jewish-Christian debates over the Jewishness of Jesus, Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, and a book and several articles on German church support for Hitler, the Aryan Jesus, Christian theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany. She's just completed a book with Sarah Imhoff, Jewish Studies and the Woman Question. The daughter of philosopher and theologian Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, she has edited 2 collections of her father's writings, including Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, Essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And she is a Guggenheim Fellow and has received numerous grants and 5 honorary doctorates from universities in Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and the United States. And I gratefully welcome Susannah Heschel to address you now.
Thank you very much, Martha Bragin, for your lovely introduction. I'm very glad to be with all of you at the Hunter College School of Social Work, a school that I admire very much, and I'm especially moved to give a lecture in memory of Maria Rosenbloom and to hear something about her life and the lives of her family, those who survived and those who did not. I would just add to this that she grew up, I heard you say, in what was then called Lemberg, today Lviv, which is a city in Western Ukraine that today is being bombed by Russian aggression. I'll just mention that Lemberg had a magnificent Jewish community. It's a city that's very beautiful, beautiful architecture. But it is strangely a university that Maria Rosenbloom attended that was very late in accepting women students. So I would just add that she was not only a pioneer in securing a higher education as a young Jewish woman with rabbinical approval, as you mentioned, but also a pioneer at that university. And I admire her and imagine it was a difficult thing. It's hard to be a pioneer, but I think we're very blessed that she survived, and I'm glad to have heard so much about her, and I'm glad that she was on the faculty at Hunter College. I want to begin with the point of why we're here this evening. We're honoring Maria Rosenbloom, and we're also honoring you as the School of Social Work and social workers for what you're doing in this particular moment in the history of the United States. Because those of us who were gathered here, I am sure, share my own deep concern about the breakdown of our society on nearly every level. Those of us who study German history are horrified by the parallels between what happened in Germany in the 1920s and today in the United States. The inflation out of control, the assassinations, random murders, a government unable, it seems, to function in a unified fashion, widespread poverty, people living without being part of a community and a social network, booming racism, conspiracy theories, and an atmosphere of resentment, contempt, hatred. And just as it was in Germany in the 1920s, everyone blames the left, and only few see the terrible danger on the right. That was true then, in the late 20s, the first couple of years of the 30s, and then came Hitler. And many of us feel today that we're living in a whirlwind of worry, fear, and anguish as we witness the rise of authoritarian regimes around the world, a diminishing commitment to democracy in this country, and to a sense of unity as a society. This COVID virus that puts us on Zoom instead of gathering together for a lecture and discussion and classes, this COVID virus is a real virus that has so killed at least 1 million Americans and millions around the world. But it's also, in some sense, a metaphor of the virus of hate that's destroying our social fabric. So I know that as social workers, your commitment is to keep us together somehow, and I admire you, and I'm grateful for the work that you do. These are terrible times, and I'm a scholar of religion, a historian of religious thought. I don't have magical answers. I wish I did, but I want to give some examples in my talk of how religion functions in relation to politics and to justice. I want to see things in both sides, good things, bad things. I want us to understand the power of religion, because perhaps we can learn something constructive about what we can undertake today. So I want to give some examples of political change that religious movements have brought about in two different directions, good things and bad things. I want to talk about the support of churches for the Nazi regime during the Third Reich and during the Second World War. It's a topic that I investigated and discovered archival materials and reconstructed that support, in particular of the Protestant church for Hitler, and I'll talk about that. But then I also want to talk about the role of religion in the civil rights movement, which is something that I lived through, because when I was growing up, my father was very deeply involved in the civil rights movement, and that, in fact, was an experience that persuaded me that I wanted to become a professor of religion, because religion seemed to be the force in American society that was making things better. So religion works on both sides. But the question is whether religion is compatible altogether with justice, and in what way? And if not, what can we do about it? Now, I have to begin by saying that I grew up in a very religious home. As an Orthodox, one would say Orthodox Jew, very Orthodox, in an Orthodox day school in New York. And I also, for some reason, was born with the feminism gene, because from the very beginning, I was questioning why I, as a woman, could not take part in those elements of religion that everyone said were the most important: Torah study and Talmud study and leading religious services and participating actively. Why, if religion is so important, why are women relegated to the sidelines? Now, with the question of whether religion is compatible with justice, feminist critique would say no. In fact, religion is our enemy. It's the enemy of women, it's the enemy of equality. The great Catholic philosopher Mary Daly, in a wonderful book that really changed my life, that she wrote in 1973, a book called God the Father, Mary Daly wrote, "If God is male, then the male is God. If God is always spoken of as male and imaged as male, then men have to stand at the top of the hierarchy in society." In other words, religion was seen initially by feminists as being the basis of sexism. Because of religion's sexism, we have sexism in human society. But then we began to question, well, what is religion? Religion claims to be coming from God, the Word of God, but we can also think about religion as a cultural expression. It is how we express our experience of God, our experience of the holy. And when we do that, we come to see that it is society itself that has created a religion in which men are valued far more than women. Can we change that? We see conflicts. We see religions that claim that all human beings are equal, and yet men are placed above women. The laws of Judaism benefit men, and they don't benefit women. Can the principles of equality, of justice, be retained while we purge religion of its sexist traditions and laws? Can we do that? Can we say, in the name of justice, we have to change our religion? Feminist theologians wrestle with this, but what's clear is we can't walk away. We ask ourselves how to bring change. How can we assure that religion is not only an expression of justice, but also a tool to prevent injustice? So I want to turn to my first example, which is the Nazi period. When we think about Nazi Germany, begin that Hitler came to power in January of 1933 and had no particular plan what to do about the Jews, what he called the Jewish problem. He talked about it in Mein Kampf, but it was all very vague. There was no plan to murder the Jews in 1933. The historian Karl Schleunis, in his book, The Twisted Road to Auschwitz, makes it clear that the Nazi regime tried different methods, what to do with the Jews, until finally they came up with the idea, let's kill them all, wipe all Jews off the face of the earth. But when Hitler first came to power, he was concerned initially with possible sources of opposition. Who might oppose Hitler and who might stir up opposition to Hitler within German society? The main concern, of course, were the churches. Churches would oppose him. What he discovered reassured him, because the churches, for a variety of reasons, gave tremendous enthusiastic support to Hitler, starting in 1933 and continuing. So finally, by 1934, Hitler was no longer worried about the churches. In 1933, he was trying to be friendly, to cultivate a relationship with churches. By 1934, he saw it wasn't necessary. And at that point, the churches actually stepped up their enthusiasm and their vocal support for the Nazi regime because they wanted to continue to win favor in Hitler's eyes. What did they do? From the beginning, from January 1933, churches placed flags with the swastika on the front doors of churches in Berlin, around the country. Some placed a swastika on the altar next to the cross. A cross and a swastika appeared on the masthead of many church newspapers. And then, of course, there was the question of what was said. In 1934, the Passion Play at Oberammergau, which is performed only every 5 or so years, was performed then. And as the actors of this village were hoisting the figure of Jesus onto the cross, the audience members screamed, "There he is, there's our Hitler." Christ and Hitler were identified in their minds. That is, not only in the minds of the theologians and the pastors who preached that Hitler was a form of Christ, that he was a God figure, but simply in the mouths of people attending, of audience members attending the Passion Play. What else? Germany felt, after the end of World War I, that it had been crucified during the war. So much suffering, so many soldiers dead, so many families without a father, a son, a brother. And then Hitler came as a Christ figure to resurrect Germany. That was promoted even before Hitler came to power. I'll give you an example of a quotation from a pastor named Julius Lloydhoiser. He was someone born in Bavaria who moved to Thuringia, and this is what he wrote in 1934. "The Reich of the Germans is for us similar to the eternal kingdom of God. For us, belief in Germany is a touchstone of our faith in God. Our love of Germany is a measure of our love for God. It was for us as if Christ had traveled through Germany and Adolf Hitler was his mouth." So you see immediately the identification that's being made here. The problem was in thinking about the Third Reich and Hitler as a Christ figure and the Third Reich as a resurrection is a kind of holy story, as if somehow now the Gospels were alive again. This became a problem for some members of the church when they had to think about the fact that Jesus was a Jew. How can you be a Christian and worship a Jewish God? This was the question that was being asked by 1935 and for the following years. And then came the answer. The answer was to remove everything Jewish from Christianity. And so, in fact, I discovered in archives in Germany that starting in 38, 1939, and through the war years, an institute was formed with a couple of hundred members, some say as many as 650 members, 200 members, prominent theologians, bishops, pastors, religion teachers, organists, lay people, an institute to remove everything Jewish from the church. What does that mean? It means, first of all, getting rid of the Old Testament, which they did, was no longer part of the Christian Bible. And it also meant redefining who Jesus was. It also meant, as they did, they published their own version of the hymnal, removing Hebrew words such as hallelujah and amen and other such words. They published their own version of a catechism saying that Jesus was an Aryan, a German who came to bring salvation to Germans. And they published their own version of the New Testament, in which they removed all the positive things that Jesus either said or did that were Jewish, that Jesus went to a synagogue, for example. And they said that Jesus was not a Jew. Jesus was born in the Galilee, and his parents were Gentile Aryans who had moved into the Galilee, possibly from Iran or from India, and so they had various theories. It sounds to us today a bit like nonsense, but in its own day, it was taken seriously and it had an influence. During the course of my own research in Germany, I met pastors who had grown up during the Third Reich and had been told in their confirmation classes that Jesus was an Aryan, and of course they believed it. But it goes a little bit beyond this also, and I'll and then move to my next example, which is it was believed that Jesus came to bring an end to Judaism, but he fell victim to the Jews who murdered him, and now Hitler was going to fulfill the mission of Jesus by destroying the Jews. That was the rhetoric of the Second World War, as Jews were in fact being murdered by the regime. Now, that's an example of the support of religion for a murderous regime. It's a much more complicated picture than that, but there's an example. What's unfortunate is that we have so little opposition within the church to this kind of thinking. There is a bit, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that everybody thought this way, but it was very minor and very marginal. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is perhaps the best known figure of a Protestant pastor who opposed the Nazi regime, and especially specifically what the regime was doing to Jews. But again, Bonhoeffer was an isolated, lonely figure who ultimately was also killed by Hitler. But I want to turn to a very different example. And this is the example of the civil rights movement. So I mentioned earlier that every religious tradition has some principles that speak of equality or of justice, prophetic traditions, scriptures, against which we measure some of the unfortunate sexism, racism within all religious traditions. What do we do when we try to use those scriptural principles as tools to fight against injustice in society? And here's where I just want to mention something personal. When I was growing up, it was very clear to me, absolutely clear to me, first of all, that women should not be second-class citizens in religion, first of all. I was clear about that. Even as a little girl, when people asked me, I said, well, it may be what men want, but it's certainly not what God wants. But it also was clear to me growing up as I got a little older that religion and racism were completely incompatible. It was impossible for a religious person to be racist. I knew, of course, about what horrible opposition existed against the civil rights movement, but at the same time, I felt those people were simply mistaken. You cannot be a religious person and believe that God is the creator of all humanity and be racist. It was only much later that I began studying the Nazi period and found that, in fact, theologians can be quite racist. Now, the question is, what happens in the civil rights movement, and what is it that was not available during the Nazi period? And there, what I find striking is that in the United States, we have a long tradition of invoking the prophets, the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, and principles of justice and equality. And that tradition extends from all the way back to the very beginning of Christians and Jews coming to this country and preaching. It's strong within the Black church in particular, and it continues to this day as something that's a uniquely American phenomenon. That is, in my studies of Christianity in Europe, I don't find the prophets being invoked in any way that's similar to this. It's something quite American. There were Jewish thinkers in Europe who did speak about the prophets as being the essence of Judaism, but it's not in the Christian world. And that, I think, is one of the problems that was faced by Christian theologians when Hitler came to power, that they didn't have the Hebrew prophets as part of their theological tradition. And so they didn't have principles of justice, of right behavior that they could invoke against Hitler. Why didn't they have it? Because starting already in the 1890s, the biblical scholarship, theological scholarship on the prophets in Germany tended to denigrate the prophets. They spoke of the prophets as ecstatics who didn't know what they were saying, that they felt unconscious, and they spouted various words, but they were essentially meaningless. And so the words of the prophets, the words of the prophet Amos, let justice roll down like water, and righteousness is a mighty stream, a verse that's in a sense the motto of the civil rights movement in the United States. That verse is simply not quoted in the sermons of pastors, of the theological publications of professors of Christian theology. But in the civil rights movement, in the civil rights era, something very different developed. And that is, it was a movement of massive social and political change that addressed systemic racism in a very fundamental way. I was present at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, when Martin Luther King spoke out against the war in Vietnam. And he made it very clear in that speech, which is one of his greatest speeches, and unfortunately a speech that's not as well known as it should be. He made it very clear in that speech that racism was systemic in the United States. The speech is an indictment of the United States. He spoke about the war in Vietnam is taking thousands of young Black men and sending them over to Vietnam to fight in a war when they didn't have a democracy of their own, justice and equality in their own country. What were they fighting for? The same kind of point that was made during the Second World War by various religious thinkers. Why were Black men fighting in Europe against fascism, against inequality, when democracy didn't exist for them back home in the United States? But in this civil rights movement, in this era, in this country, Dr. King invoked the prophetic tradition in a way that made the civil rights movement at the same time a kind of ecumenical movement, an interreligious movement that brought together people from a variety of different faiths in a way that had never happened. I cannot think of any other movement in the history of the United States or any other country where so many religious leaders of different movements came together. And they came together because Dr. King invoked basic, fundamental human principles, drawing on scripture, drawing on the Bible. And in that call of the voice of the prophets, the response came from so many. It included responses from Jews who in many ways felt that Dr. King was offering a kind of a salve, an S-A-L-V-E, a kind of healing for the wounds the Jews had experienced during the Holocaust. It was a moment of inclusion. I can tell you that my father, who came as a refugee to this country, had been in Germany in the 30s, and there the Protestant theologians were throwing the Old Testament out of the Bible. And he came to this country, and Dr. King was quoting the Hebrew prophets. He was quoting the Exodus from Egypt. He was the figure of Moses bringing us together. And there I find what's important is for us to take a moment, and I will just do this briefly, to talk about what is the prophetic tradition and why was it in those days so incredibly powerful in being able to soften hardened hearts. And not only that, but to make it very clear in the United States at a certain point, as the historian David Chappelle has shown, that coming up with a theology of segregation simply was no longer possible. It was no longer possible by the mid-1960s for a pastor or a rabbi to preach in a sermon in favor of segregation based on the Bible. Dr. King changed the way we were able to think about the Bible and to use the Bible in our religious teachings, in churches, and in synagogues. And I would add to that, by the way, that although there were not many Muslim leaders participating in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, I want to just add that in the Islamic tradition, the centrality of the Prophet Muhammad is an exemplary theology that puts prophecy right at the heart of the religion. And I would also just say as a footnote from my own study, I think that part of the contempt for the prophets expressed by German Christian theologians in the first half of the 20th century came in part out of their Islamophobia, out of their contempt for Islam and their contempt for the Prophet Muhammad. But what is prophecy? And here I want to just say very briefly a few words and then I'll conclude. What is it to be a prophet? My father wrote a book about the prophets. It became very important to many civil rights leaders. It was a book that he actually wrote first in Germany in 1932 as his doctoral dissertation and was then published in English 30 years later. And so I want to quote a bit from that book. What is a prophet? A prophet is a person who suffers the harm done to others. A prophet is a person who holds God and human beings in one thought at one time at all times. So a prophet suffers the harm done to others because the essence of prophecy is compassion, empathy. My father used to say, if there's one word that characterizes Judaism, it's compassion. Compassion because in the Hebrew Bible, God shows compassion for human beings, and the prophets teach us that when I injure another person, I injure God. And when I give strength to another person, I strengthen God. And you can say, what does that mean? Is that some kind of magical idea? But the answer is, when I help another human being, and that is, I would say, the essence of social work, when I help another human being, I make space for more of God in this world. I increase the presence of God when I have compassion for another person and help someone. What is then a prophet? Prophecy, my father writes, is a voice. It's a voice that we have to hear. What is the voice? Prophecy is the voice that God has given to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profane riches of the world, because the prophet's ear perceives the silent scream. There are those in our society whose suffering is unheard because of human callousness. There are people who don't have the ability to make their voice heard and known. And when they do, too often the response is indifference. Indifference is the root of evil, because the opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. To be indifferent to another person, to be so callous, is the opposite of being a religious person. That is, if there are principles in religion to combat injustice, it's not so much principles of justice as it is the fundamental attunement to the suffering of other people, to getting rid of callousness and indifference. And we can ask, as some people have, aren't the prophets just a little too hysterical? After all, there are bad things in the world. Yes, there are people suffering, but why be so loud about it? Why scream about it from the rooftops the way Amos screams? And my father says, if the prophet's sensitivity to evil is called hysterical, what name should we give to the indifference that the prophet is criticizing? Because in fact, some are guilty, but all of us are responsible. What is then injustice? Injustice is accepting injustice as the way things simply are. Injustice is to remain unmoved, as if nothing calamitous is happening in our midst when people are gunned down because their skin is black. What is injustice? It's making ourselves deaf to the agony around us. Injustice is what Afro-pessimists have identified. I think of Frank Wilderson or Tendai Sidhole, who say, it's as if people with black skin are viewed as non-life. When Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd, he didn't even think he was murdering a human being. Why? Because a black person is not life? Have we come to that? So the root of injustice is callousness. And of course, it's clear not all of us can be a Martin Luther King or a Prophet Amos, but at least we can try to be people who have received this prophetic tradition. not so much to push certain principles of religion, doctrines, teachings, but simply the basic fundamental idea that callousness is the opposite of being religious, and to be religious means never to be indifferent to other people's suffering. So I want to conclude now with the question of how do we find hope in a time of despair? It's very hard to have faith, the faith that we might hear, for example, in the prophet Isaiah, when we feel closer to the prophet Jeremiah, who speaks of desolation and gives voice to our mood. We're all worried that this United States, this democracy, which we feel is a great rock of ages, that this may become just a temporary moment in history, that this country too may fall victim to a fascist regime or to a civil war. But most of all, we're aware that we're surrounded by people who are very angry and have very hardened hearts. And so my last point is simply to mention a teaching from a commentary on the Bible that I came across recently and that I like very much. It's a commentary on verse 1 of chapter 10 of the book of Exodus. It's a famous verse where God tells Moses, "Come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart." And the commentary looks at that verse. And this is a commentary in a Hebrew text called the Kedushas Levi. It's by Levi Yitzhak Berdichev, a Hasidic master of the late 18th century. The commentary looks at that passage, and the Hebrew is Boel Paro ki ani hechbadati et libo. And it says the word hardened, the commentary says, the word in Hebrew, the root of the word, means hard, but it can also mean heavy, can also mean honor, dignity, and glory. And the passage says, the interpretation says, in fact, God is not saying, I have hardened Pharaoh's heart. God is saying, I have made Pharaoh's heart capable of dignity. Now, why does the interpreter say this? Because he points out that a few verses later, Pharaoh says, I have sinned. Chatasi, I have sinned. And I was struck by that because I realized, first of all, that it's very difficult for all human beings, everyone, to say, I have sinned. I've made a mistake. I've been wrong. Forgive me. It's a very hard thing for people to do. And the question is why? And what this commentary is saying, this interpretation, is that a person cannot repent, cannot say, I have sinned, unless they have a sense of dignity. If you don't have a feeling of your own dignity, how can you say, how can you admit that you've done wrong and ask for forgiveness? Now, what strikes me about that is how important that interpretation is for us today. And I'll tell you what I mean. I see in this country people going to rallies, Trump rallies, where Trump gets up and makes fun of people. I see it on television, and I don't actually own a television, but I know it from the clips. A lot of mockery of the disabled, mockery of people for their country of origin, for their ethnicity, for their religion, for their skin color, mockery and contempt. And I wonder about all of those people at those rallies, making fun, mocking, laughing. And I wonder, where is their dignity? Because in mocking other human beings, we destroy our own dignity. A person of dignity does not mock other people. And what I realized in reading that commentary, that among all the many things we need to do in this time to heal this country and to change course quickly, I also think that somehow we have a big task to get those people filled with mockery and contempt to regain their own dignity and to be able to say for themselves, yes, that was wrong. So I would just say in conclusion that if there is a long list of things we need to do, religion, in religion circles, political circles, in social work circles, one of the things that I urge us to think about is how can we restore the dignity of the people who have destroyed their own dignity over the course of the last years, and get them finally to repent and to realize that injustice for one is injustice for all. That behaving with dignity toward other people restores one's own dignity and creates a decent and just society for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and gave us lots of material to think about. A pleasure to meet you as well. I'm Gary Mallon. I'm the Associate Dean here. And I'm going to just field some questions. If folks have a comment or a question, you could put it in the chat, which is in the bottom of your screen there. Or if you would like to click on the little tab at the bottom of your screen that says reactions, you can raise your hand virtually and I will acknowledge you and we'll have some dialogue. So whoever would like to begin, we're happy to do that. First question is always the hardest one, right? I was very struck by what you said about restoring dignity. And as social workers, I think that's something that, we strive to do. Also, I think your discussion about indifference was really critical as well. Again, in our own profession and in our work that we do with people, we see a lot of folks who have indifference, and then the alternative is to see people who are, filled with compassion and empathy, which, is one of the, it's very hard. I think I always say to teach empathy, but I think that it's also critical as social workers to kind of bring people to the point at which they are compassionate and empathic to the people that they work with. So thank you for bringing those topics up.
Thank you. I also would like to just say that restoring dignity requires a systemic dignity. So the opposite of systemic dignity, of course, is systemic racism. But it's restoring a person's dignity requires a change in the social, political, and economic order. And so I'm seeing it in those terms as well.
Yeah, thank you. I see that Joanna has her hand up, and Joanna, feel free to ask your question or make your comment. Make sure you're unmuted. Okay.
First of all, I want to thank you from the depths of my heart and soul, as somebody who was deeply close and adored Maria and feels a very deep connection to the Gitterman family for sustaining her tradition and her memory. It's certainly bringing me to tears. My question is really, in this time that feels so dark, not just here, but in the whole world on every single level, how do you suggest that we restore dignity in a culture that feels so inflamed with divisiveness and polarization, and that's true on every single level in this country and throughout the world?
Yes, and I think it is. It's a very big task, and I would say that if there is one thing that we would like to see happen from religious leaders, but from people in every field, it is, let's say this, when we're all told in every religious tradition that when someone dies, you treat the body with respect. Everyone knows that. Dead bodies washed and covered and buried with prayer, with solemnity, with dignity. And it's interesting that we're to treat the body with dignity because, of course, a body that is dead doesn't know how it's being treated. But what is so clear is that every religion understands that in treating the body with dignity, we create dignity for ourselves. We become people of dignity. It is what we convey to another person. That's what creates our dignity. And in that sense, I also see how difficult it is when someone has been treated with contempt for that person to be able to show dignity to another. Because the natural reaction to being treated with contempt is to be angry, to be enraged, and to take it out on someone. So it becomes a domino effect, and I understand that. And the question is, how can we intervene? As Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it, how can you put a spoke in the wheel to stop it from moving? And we need much of that, because when a person is treated respectfully, with dignity, with kindness, with compassion, that person is transformed. And yet so much of our society is set up institutionally to show contempt for other people on so many levels. So what we have to change the way in which we speak to one another, the way in which we behave toward others, and realize, perhaps as a motivation, that it's not just what you convey to another person, but what you're also doing to yourself. I do think that there are other countries seem to be better at understanding that than we are. The message hasn't gone out very well here.
We have another question from Daniel Gitterman about how did your father become involved in the civil rights movement? It's a two-part question, but that's the first part.
So, my father came to this country as a refugee in March of 1940, and his mother, his sister, his whole extended family was wiped out. He came with nothing. He was here during the war in Cincinnati at Hebrew Union College, where he lived in a dorm room and marched with the other rabbis in Washington and protested the United States' failure to accept more Jewish refugees from Europe. He then moved to New York to the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1946 and became a professor there and published a great deal, quite a few books in the course of less than 10 years. Many books came out, and he continued writing. But as those books were published, he came to be invited to give lectures at public occasions, the White House Conference on Children and Youth and on Aging. And he was invited to a conference in Chicago in January of 1963 on religion and race. It was a conference organized by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, an ecumenical group. And my father and Dr. King both gave keynote lectures at that gathering in Chicago. And my father opened his lecture by saying, at the first summit on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. It was a very dramatic speech. He went on to say that racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. It was a speech that Cornel West has said is the most powerful speech against racism given by a white man since William Garrison. So they met at that particular conference in Chicago, and when they met, they just immediately bonded, as we say nowadays. And they started giving talks together to Jewish groups and college groups and so on. And they became very close, and the families became close. So my father was also involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam, and it was his organization that brought Dr. King to speak out against the war in 1967, which was quite a difficult decision. Dr. King was attacked for speaking out against the war. But yes, and I've remained close with Dr. King's children and with other members of the civil rights movement who I find to be extraordinary human beings. And one of the things that's so remarkable to me is that here it is 60 years later, and the people from the civil rights era still tell me how grateful they are for my father's involvement. And what I learned from this is that the nonviolent training that was undertaken in those years was not just about don't hit someone if they hit you. It was about becoming a different kind of person. It's about a training of the heart and soul, the way you relate to other people, the kind of person you are as a friend, as a member of a family and community. And I think that nonviolence curriculum ought to be brought back. I think it has a lot to teach us today, whether it's from the Highlander School or what Reverend James Lawson developed in the Nashville program. There's much there that we still need very, very badly in this country. Principles of nonviolence have a lot to tell us. But you said there was a second part.
Yeah, the second part is, and in your opinion, what is the state of Jewish and Black relations today?
Oh, I think that the relations are wonderful. There are numerous scholars, professors, and intellectuals, Black intellectuals, writing about racism in collaboration with Jewish scholars, such as myself, but also others, friends of mine, Shaul Magid, my colleague at Dartmouth, or Jacques Berliner Blau at Georgetown, who had just co-authored a book with his colleague, Terrence Johnson, also at Georgetown, that I recommend, that just came out a few weeks ago. But our interactions and our dialogues are much actually deeper and more sophisticated than they were. J. Cameron Carter, who teaches at Indiana University, published a book called Race, A Theological Account, maybe 15, 20 years ago, in which this big, thick book, makes a strong argument that Christianity's effort, early Christianity's effort to overcome Judaism, established a way of thinking that ultimately turned into racism, for instance. And I've given lectures together with Cornel West. So I think that actually there's a very lively and wonderful conversation that's taking place, and I appreciate it very much. We teach classes also at Dartmouth and elsewhere on Black Jewish relations, and I think that the conversation is really smart and really interesting.
Great, thank you. Oh, I see another question in the chat. Daniel said, thank you. You remind me of my great aunt. That's a big compliment. That's nice. Other questions or comments or thoughts that folks might have? I think Professor Gitterman's getting ready to ask a question. He's putting his glasses on.
Question, I just think the silence has to do with us being in awe of your brilliance. I've never heard such a lecture. And my aunt will be off the floor now. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I wish I had known your aunt. And I hope that it will be possible one day to go to Lemberg, what is now Lviv or Lvov, to visit that city, because, you know, your aunt came from a really remarkable part of the world. There's some extraordinary people who came from that city. And I hope that this horrific, destructive, I don't even call it war, it's an act of aggression, will come to an end. And we'll be able to visit. I have many relatives buried all over Ukraine, and I would like to visit their graves. And I hope that it will be possible one day. I'm terribly afraid that this Russian attack is going to go on for some time, and I worry about landmines that they may be planting around Ukraine. I'm very worried about that. But I also just want to point out too that it's very striking that so many survivors of the Holocaust came to this country, became involved in the civil rights movement. And I really do think that, and many of them said, after what was done to me, I have to do this. Or after people were so indifferent, this is what I have to do. I also think it was very healing. You know, in the 50s, Jews in America were hiding their Jewishness. My mother told me that people would hide their Hebrew school books when they went to public school. And the civil rights movement changed that. It made us feel proud to be Jewish. It made us feel that we have the right to be Jewish in public and nothing to fear. And of course, it's changing now because the violence that is increasing constantly is very frightening for all of us. Jews can conceal, whether Jews are white or Jews of color, can conceal their Jewishness, but a lot of Jews don't want to conceal that they're Jewish. But of course, if you have black skin, if you're Asian, you can't conceal. And the kinds of attacks that are happening constantly also show us, as we saw from this horrific murder in Buffalo and this what so-called manifesto written by the murderer, it has on and on and on against Jews and blacks, Jews and blacks. We are blamed as Jews for critical race theory, for feminism, for liberalism, for immigrants, and so on. It's all intertwined. Our lives are intertwined. And if we're going to be able to change the tone of this country, we have to do it together in alliances. And that's very clear to us.
Thank you. We have another question from Sonia Herzenberg-Clement. Sonia, you want to? I saw your hand up. Hi.
Yes. It's not a question. I wanted to express my gratitude for this amazing lecture and gratitude, Professor Heschel, for your father's teaching that we can also pray with our feet. We don't just pray in other ways. That praying with our feet is when we become involved and become activists. And I wanted also to express gratitude to my professors, Alex Gitterman and Naomi Gitterman, and Anna Paulino. You have been my teachers a long time ago. And Alex, I think you followed your aunt's advice and teaching to do for others. You created generations of social workers, and you taught them how to listen with empathy. And you taught them how to talk to another person as an I and thou, not as an I and it, but as another human being. But most of all, you also taught us that humor is fine. We don't have to be serious all the time. We can introduce humor and warmth in our relationships. And I'm very grateful for everything I have learned from the three of you and from reading Professor Heschel's father's writings. And just being in this gathering today has been very inspiring, and I thank everyone who organized it. And it's just an honor and a joy to be here.
Thank you very much. Professor Heschel, do you have any closing remarks, closing comments before we thank you And
Barry, there's a question
oh,
from
there is?
Barry
Oh,
Gold.
sorry.
There's a
Uh,
question from Barry Gold.
oh, go ahead, Barry. Sorry about that. Hi.
Hi. So first, I wanted to echo everybody and say what a moving talk you just gave. I really do appreciate it. And Al, I'm still in tears from listening to you. I've known you for many years. I've never heard that story. And the story is one that needs to be told, and thank you for telling it. I just wanted to note I've seen a documentary, and the reason I've seen it is because my daughter's boyfriend's grandparents are in it. There's a documentary called Beyond Swastika and Jim Crow, and it's a story of a number of refugees from Europe who fled Hitler, came to the United States, and many of them were professors who could not get jobs at a lot of big institutions or more noted institutions because they were Jewish, but also because of what they had been through, the whole refugee experience. They found themselves teaching at historically Black colleges, and it's a fascinating documentary about exactly what you were talking about, Professor. And so I just wanted to note that if anybody has an opportunity to see it, it's well worthwhile. It's a story that I had never known, and the way that the professors, Jewish Europeans, were able to bond with Black students in the South, Black Americans in the South, is really quite something. So I just wanted to note that it just flowed from what you were talking about.
Thank you. Yeah, I've seen that documentary and it's great. And there are also two books by a professor now retired named Eileen Schrecker about the history of universities in America. And they're page-turner books. They're fascinating and they're so well written. But they also talk about this and also about McCarthyism and its impact on the universities. So yeah, thank you. But there are memoirs. Maybe I'll just mention one. I was very moved by a very small memoir that I bought from Amazon. It's by a rabbi named Seymour Atlas. He was an Orthodox Jew from the New York area who took a position as rabbi in Montgomery, Alabama in the early 1950s. The synagogue congregation was not Orthodox, and he was, and so there were some problems. But his synagogue was just down the road from Dr. King's church in Montgomery. And Dr. King wanted to learn Hebrew or improve his Hebrew. He had learned some in seminary, to read the Bible in Hebrew, and came to Rabbi Atlas and asked him if they could work together. And Rabbi Atlas was delighted and invited Dr. King to come to his office. Let's sit together. He describes all of this in the memoir, Seymour Atlas. And members of the synagogue told Rabbi Atlas that Dr. King could not enter the synagogue through the front door, that he had to go through the back door. And Rabbi Atlas was enraged. But I want to mention this just to show, because I don't want to give the impression that somehow that all rabbis or all Jews were supportive of the civil rights movement just because my father was. There was the opposite, of course. And Rabbi Atlas quit and left and went back up north. But I found that very, very disturbing and also very important to be aware. The idea that they would say this to him. When you ask for some concluding remarks, and I just want to say again, the civil rights movement was a gift to America. It was a gift that I don't think we fully appreciated. We have a lot still to do because what it accomplished, as you know, is being undone on a daily basis in state legislatures that are eroding voting rights. And yes, my father marched in Selma and came back and said, I felt my legs were praying. but it was a march for voting rights. And look what's going on in this country. They're trying to eviscerate voting rights. So I guess the final remarks that I just want to make briefly is, why is it so important that the civil rights movement was an interreligious movement? I think it's important because religious dialogue allows us to see ourselves through other eyes. It allows us to find commonalities with people who are very different from ourselves. And interreligious, I want to say, is not only, for example, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, so on, but within the Jewish community, those who are Reform and those who are Orthodox often just don't talk to each other. Can we develop that? Can we find commonalities? Interreligious dialogue can help us learn new ways of thinking. It could also push us. It can also help us because we all have problems, including sexism in every religious tradition. So maybe sitting down and admitting that we have the problem, we can start to talk about how to go about solving the problem. I'll just leave you finally with one image that I think is amazing and moving. I've been to Selma several times. The first time was in the year 2000. I actually went on a trip with my husband and our baby that was led by Congressman John Lewis. It was open to members of Congress, and then a few other people were invited to come, and it was amazing. We went through Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma. And then after that trip ended, we went to visit the home in which Dr. King had lived for several months during the Selma campaign. And it was the house where my father stayed overnight before the march. It was the home of a dentist, a Black dentist in Selma, Dr. Sullivan Jackson, and his wife, and at the time their little girl, Joanna Jackson. When we came to visit, Mrs. Jackson said that that morning of the march in Selma, she got up from her bedroom and she went into the living room. And there she saw in one corner of the room, Dr. King saying his morning prayers. And another corner of the room was my father saying his morning prayers. And then off to the side near the dining room, there were a couple of others praying quietly. That was an extraordinary image, and it was deeply moving to Mrs. Jackson. But I think moments like that, of people coming together in prayer and then going out to march for social justice, for basic human rights, that image is something that we should, I think, take to our hearts and keep alive. The film Selma has that scene, but instead of showing everybody praying, they have Mrs. Jackson in the kitchen cooking breakfast for everyone, and everyone's joking around. Because somehow, sometimes prayer isn't acceptable for some parts of American society. But I think we need that image of the different people, different faiths, praying in the same living room. That was also what the civil rights movement created. And that's an image to me of gentleness, of thoughtfulness, of people of great dignity, restoring themselves and getting ready for something that's going to be actually quite taxing, but they're sustaining themselves with their prayer. So I just want to leave you with that image of that living room, which, by the way, is a house that's still standing in Selma. It's been preserved by their daughter all these years. And you can see that the furniture is the same. The bed where Dr. King slept, everything is still the same. But I leave you with that image and hope that we can have one day a society in which that living room will be a symbol for how we live together. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was good to be with you. Thank you for your questions and comments. And it's wonderful to give tribute to Maria Rosenbloom, an extraordinary human being. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. Thank you.
That was wonderful. On behalf of our school and the Maria Rosenbloom lecture series and the Gitterman family, thank you so much, Dr. Heschel. You were
Thank you.
really remarkable, and I think we all are very moved by your presentation. Thank you so much for being with us. And Martha Bragin, thank you for connecting us to this wonderful woman.
Wonderful,
It was
wonderful.
great. It was great to hear from you. Thanks so much.
Wonderful.